Okay.
What was this one doing?
And I'm gonna look at you.
Yep.
Okay.
And then, Tom, once we get rolling,
Yeah, I can't do anything.
we can't have a flash.
Yep. Or the sound.
Yeah, or the sound of the flash.
The mic, John?
Oh, yeah, details. We're so good on details, but the
Yeah.
mic is kind of important.
Okay.
What do you think about right here, Emily?
That should do it, shouldn't it?
I mean,
Yeah.
I got a little loop in it that actually would be distracting, I think.
Could be down just a little bit
Or
further.
just put it
maybe.
Put it under, yeah, there you go.
There, and, yeah, down,
Like here?
yeah, right about there. I think that's
All right.
it.
Pull that down.
Advance.
Okay.
Okay, and you could maybe just say testing 1, 2, 3 a couple times.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
All right. Let me know when you're ready.
It's going, I think, well, let me
Okay.
just check the other camera.
All right.
I think they're
What are we
both-
talking about, 41 years ago?
Yeah. 41 years ago.
Holy toledo.
So, by the way, I was over, Chris,
Four times your age.
yeah, I was over at, Chris Coleman had a fundraiser this morning,
Yeah.
St. Patrick's Day, and Chris and Pat Coleman wanted to say hi to you.
It's St. Patrick's Day today, isn't it?
That's right.
So-
That's
Yeah,
right.
I remembered
Did-
for once.
Did they have a good turnout?
They had a good turnout,
Yeah.
yeah. Although I think he's gonna have a tougher election this time. I don't know who's gonna
Chris?
emerge.
Oh, I think you'll be all right.
They-
What do I know?
He's done some gutsy things that
Yeah.
needed to be done, and
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I don't know.
But I think he'll make it. What do I know?
Yeah, well, what do any of us know about that stuff anymore?
Okay,
All right.
we're ready to roll here.
What can you give us in the way of brief impressions of each of the protagonists in the 1968 campaign? Comments about your relationships with each and about their characters and personalities. We could start out with Lyndon Johnson.
You have to think of him in two ways. One, as a hugely successful president, a Southerner who led the great civil rights reforms in American history, even though he came from a background, and a different background by far, and who presided over what I call the high tide of American social reform. On the other hand, a person full of doubts, sometimes pettiness, a kind of a hungry man, something missing there. He did a lot for the country, but a mixed memory.
Hubert Humphrey.
Wonderfully warm, human, brilliant, empathetic, inspiring public leader, undoubtedly the most effective, impressive leader in Minnesota's history, in my opinion. We've had many, and I'm talking about politics, but I don't think we've had any that have exceeded Humphrey in his sweep, scope in the years that he influenced government at all across the nation. Entwined in the war, became vice president under Lyndon Johnson, which I think historically he'd been better off to stay in the Senate. Yet bounced back, went back to the Senate. Everybody loved him, and when he died, he had a funeral that was in many ways more impressive than most presidential funerals. He was beloved, not just here, but across the nation and the world.
Gene McCarthy.
Very gifted, almost elegant man. Very important in eliminating Protestant Catholic tensions in Minnesota. I think his election helped lead to Kennedy's election and the elimination of those religious biases that hurting the country so much. Part of the high tide that we talked about. when he and Humphrey were together, the Democrats were unbeatable in Minnesota. They made such a wonderful pair. But they did split, partly over the war, over other issues, I think. And in a way that's sort of difficult to just define, let alone remember, he sort of, toward the end of his career, just sort of backed off. And I don't say withdrew, but, you know, he kind of ran for president, really, you know, a lot of guts, and that probably brought Lyndon Johnson down and helped end the war in Vietnam, a courageous move on his part, very successful, and then he faded out of the campaign. He left the Senate, he, I think, sort of left the Democratic Party, and he lived a different life that he wanted to lead. Nevertheless, remained a highly respected, gifted man. There's a lot about his life that is very positive, and he's one of the Minnesota greats.
Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy was a gifted, driven man, full of compassion, with a driving attention devoted to the problems of the poor, the disadvantaged, the minorities, the hungry, and a person who, you know, I sat alongside him for some years, a friend of mine, and yet some days I felt I didn't know him. He'd get into these moods. He was somewhere else. He was there, but his mind was somewhere else. But a martyr, horrible thing to happen, a very important, consequential leader in American life.
How old were you in 1968?
28, 38, 48, figure it out.
How did Minnesota play a bigger-than-life role in the drama that unfolded in 1968?
Well, we were all there. This little state held the stage there for a long time. You know, we had this tendency to run Minnesotans for president. We had Harold Stassen, who ran as a Republican more than once. Humphrey, he wanted to run. McCarthy ran. I'm sure there's some others in there that thought, I ran, yeah, I forgot about me. And but in 68, and the war was the catalyst that sort of blew the whole thing apart. Humphrey's rise to the presidency, he had been vice president, now was running to replace Lyndon Johnson, all came to head at the Chicago Convention, which was a violent disaster. And the people that were angry at the war, and some people that weren't that concerned about civility, clashed with the establishment, both within the convention hall and especially outside the hall. The story out of Chicago was the violence, the clash, the anger, and poor Hubert was trying to rise above that. He got nominated, but he was given a highly damaged gift. But during the course of the campaign, and by speaking out more clearly on the Vietnam War, he almost won that election, missed by a sliver, and one of the great comebacks in American history. I'll stop there.
How did the intense conflicts of 1968 at the national level play out in Minnesota in the DFL party, at the precinct caucuses and at the state convention?
Well, and I forget the figures now, but the same intense levels of protest against the war and anger of Lyndon Johnson's leadership in the war boiled over in the Minnesota precinct caucuses. And I think that we were defeated in at least all the urban districts, and it was a black eye for Hubert.
And that came on the heels of the Keith Rovach struggle in 1966 too.
So we had that division in '66, yeah, and that helped tear us apart too. We had, like from '54 onward, in '54 we had our first big victory with the Democrats taking most of the state capital, and Humphrey had been elected in '48, was re-elected. We were really becoming the dominant majority party, and in 1958 McCarthy got elected to the United States Senate. We picked up some more, and we were really on a roll in Minnesota. And then in '66 we stumbled in the Rovach-Keith fight, but in '68, I mean, that was real poison.
Yeah, I remember it well.
Yeah.
How did the turmoil of maybe '66, but more importantly '68, impact long-term friendships that you had within the DFL party?
Well, particularly the war issue became very personal, and a lot of people became very angry. And while a lot of those animosities faded, I could still sit down with old timers and give them about 2 minutes, and they'll start telling you about that damn so and so. It drove deep divisions into our party that I think it's now history, but for a long time it wasn't just history. A lot of anger about the way the convention was, how delegates were picked, about how the fact that minorities, women, new Americans were not allowed or weren't successfully there, about the men were running too much of our world, everybody should be involved. And this led slowly to a bunch of fundamental reforms of the Democratic Party in all aspects of those issues that did really change the openness, the representativeness, and the elimination of bias in the Democratic Party, which is one of the reasons we have the president we have today.
What was your role in the 1968 campaign?
Well, I was in the Senate, but I was also co-chair of the Humphrey United Democrats for Humphrey, I think we called it, with Fred Harris from Oklahoma. And we were heading up a national effort to persuade delegates to vote for Humphrey, and we were, of course there was a big staff there that did it, but we sort of tried to help out on the edges. And and then I tried very hard to work out a compromise peace plank for the National Convention's platform. And with Hubert's approval and with the help of a lot of people, we worked out language that I think could have brought a lot of moderates at that convention who were against the war behind Hubert, and it would have helped. But once it looked like we had it about ready to go, the White House went nuts and it basically took the compromise away from us, demanded that the convention vote up or down on Johnson's war, and it just helped rip it apart.
As I recall, I've been reading Isley's book.
Yeah.
Almost the President.
Great book.
It is a great book, and he mentions how it was your idea to add Fred Harris, and
Yes. Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Just, hold on a second, I'm just doing a refocus, checking everything out.
Okay. So far, so good?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
I'm just changing position.
Well, one of the things was that Hubert was now being cast as an old politician, part of the establishment, having been around too long in Washington and disconnected from young America. That was the rap on him. And so one of the things we tried to do was get some young leadership there that would answer that question by who was there. So Fred and I are both very young senators, new leaders, and we, I think, did some good in killing that issue.
In the 1960s, we had a military draft. Now we have a voluntary army. Did fear of the draft have the effect of turning normally apathetic students into activists?
Oh, no question about it. A lot of things happened because of the draft. Practically every young man had a good chance of being picked when the draft numbers were called. And that not only concentrated the young men's minds, but it concentrated the parents' minds and their relatives. And as the death count rose in Vietnam, that issue really stirred up not just Minnesotans, but Americans, stirred up college campuses. It was a white-hot pitch. And I would go to meetings and I would get cornered by parents and so on. And they wanted this stopped. And it was their son. And they wanted it over. And they were not kidding. And it was the draft that helped fuel this thing. And I'll never forget when Nixon got elected, he ended the draft. And within a month, the noise from the campuses and so on just sort of drifted away. Because people were not as directly threatened personally in their own families. And it made a big difference. And that's what I think led to the voluntary military system that we have now. You know, I think it was the right thing to do. I supported it. But on the other hand, the old system with all of its many inadequacies engaged all Americans in about whether we should be in that war or not. Now we have a situation where other kids are doing the fighting. And I'm not sure that we're always as fully engaged in the consequences of using American power as we might have been.
I've often thought the same thing.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a year with more political melodrama?
No, it was unbelievable. I had once gone to Vietnam as a young senator, and I remember taking off from Saigon, and guns are going off, you know, and you can see campfires all over the place, and I said, wow, I'm glad to get out of here. And when I left Chicago at the end of that convention, I felt it's the same way. You know, there were fires around, people battling, anger, oh man. And of course it led to that long, perilous campaign. I'm sure it led to Hubert's defeat, although he almost made it. It led to a deeply divided party that spent the next maybe the next decade trying to sort it out. And you know, when you think of that trip, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson won by unprecedented amounts. Humphrey was our vice president. We had a Congress, I think we had 68 Democrats in the first Senate I attended. They had a fifth row of senators. There was no room for us. And the Republican side of the Senate looked like some deserted mining camp or something. There weren't many of them there. And within 4 years, we'd taken victory and we were now deeply on the defensive, and Johnson didn't dare run again.
I think about it was 68 with the Battle of Khe Sanh, the Tet Offensive that kind
Oh, yeah.
of turned public.
It did, no question about it. I think it was turning anyway, but the Tet Offensive, I think, and My Lai massacre, and some of the battles that occurred there that were, we had complete coverage from American press and television, and so American people knew what was happening. The Tet Offensive, where Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces penetrated every defense sector we had in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy grounds. And we took terrible losses. They took worse losses. But the psychological impact on Americans was, well, this isn't working. You read the Pentagon Papers, there were all kinds of, let's say, dishonest things being said to the American people about how this war was going, the body counts and so on. And the Pentagon Papers very, because it was a conscious effort to mislead the American people, wholly intolerable. And so Americans believed some of this and were set up, and suddenly along comes the Tet Offensive. And this enemy that's supposed to be disappearing is able to do this sort of thing. And I think it was a very consequential, profound moment in America about its views of Vietnam, its trust in the American government, in the public system. I think it all took a beating there.
Where were you when you learned that LBJ had withdrawn from running?
I was on a NBC news program at 8 o'clock at night with Scoop Jackson. We're going to talk about something, I forget what it was. And we were watching Lyndon speak, and then we were going to come on and talk about it. And of course, Lyndon gives his speech, and right at the end he announces he's not running, and he's quitting, he's leaving, and then the cameras turn on us. And I didn't know what to do, so I said, well, I think Hubert should run. So I got started right there. But it was really, we didn't get any warning.
Not a lot of prep time to compose.
No.
Martin Luther King was assassinated. Where were you when that occurred?
We were at a Democratic black tie dinner in downtown, a fancy hotel in downtown Washington. And during the dinner, the rumors started spreading around the hall that King had been shot. And the ceremony said, we're going to carry on, this has happened, we're going to carry on. And Hubert got up. He said, let's say a prayer and let's go home. Typical Hubert, he knew what happened, and that's what people wanted to do. Yeah.
Bobby Kennedy's assassinated. How did you learn about his death?
I think I was watching returns out of the California primary. I forget when this happened, later at night, I think, when he was leaving. Yeah, he'd given a speech at a rally in a hotel in downtown Los Angeles, and he was heading out the hotel room, and this guy was waiting for him in the kitchen or something and got him. And then we waited for another hour or so, hoping that there would be good news, knowing that it probably wasn't. A terrible blow. I mean, this is, it's now been Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, now Bobby. It just seemed like we'd lost our center as Americans. And the bloodshed, and all of them heroes, martyrs, people that stood for big things that America needed, had to do, like civil rights. Can you think, how could we have dealt with problems that we have today if we hadn't cleaned up that civil rights scandal and eliminated. How could we have done it? I think these people saved our nation. Martin Luther King saved our nation.
Muriel Humphrey said to Hubert, again, reverting back to Isley's book, she told him that he couldn't win the presidency anymore because it was her sense that the American public was just fatigued of all the chaos associated with the Democratic Party. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that was a big, big factor. And in fact, Richard Nixon ran on chaos. If you look at the ads that he ran in the '68 campaign, they were all about riots and exploding cities and the National Guard having to run down rioters and scenes from the Chicago Convention. It was all about a country falling apart and Nixon, knowing how to deal with it.
Were you surprised when McCarthy announced for the presidency?
I don't think so. I don't think I knew that he was going to do that, but he had become a critic of the war. I know that he thought he had a chance of becoming vice president in '64. He did not tell me this, but I'm pretty sure he was offended by the way he thought he was handled at the convention. And he was very angry about it. And I think all of those things came together. He found a way to oppose the war, and as he said it, he also hoped to do something to restore some public trust in the American political system. And he did. I mean, this was a very courageous act. And while he didn't carry New Hampshire, he missed just by a sliver. And by the time he got out to the Wisconsin primary, polls showed him ahead 3-4 to 1, and Johnson was going to be humiliated. And so he made his announcements a couple days before the Wisconsin primary.
You know, your point about McCarthy being offended by what happened in '64, he actually told me that he was. I had a 3-hour lunch with him at the Lexington, and he told me that he was really upset about that.
No, I'm sure it's true, but you know, but I'm not saying that's why he ran, but I bet at least he had that in his head.
What was Humphrey's reaction to McCarthy running?
I don't think he was surprised. I mean, by this time, the relationship between Humphrey and McCarthy, as I would say, was correct. It wasn't hostile. They functioned together, but they were going down different roads now. And but I think Humphrey very much wanted to be president. I know that. And I think that he had hoped that when McCarthy's primary efforts and so on were over, if not Humphrey got nominated, that McCarthy would stand up there and publicly support him. But that didn't happen. Toward the end, there were some efforts to bring that about, but that relationship didn't heal, and the public knew that.
How did McCarthy's announcement affect your relationship with him?
These are tough questions. Well, we had a double relationship too. I mean, in the Senate, we worked together, I think, pretty well. We were together on most of the issues, but not all the issues. Gene's a very independent guy. He had his own drummer, and he would do his things his way. Brilliant guy. He'd been in the Senate a lot longer than I had, and we worked together, but it wasn't like a kind of a close collegial relationship of the kind I had with Hubert. You know, I admired him. I admire him. Now he made a lot of wonderful contributions to our society, and I don't want to be misunderstood in that. And I don't think I was very surprised when he ran for president.
You talked a little bit earlier about your relationship with RFK. What was
Yeah.
your reaction to him getting into the fray, and did that affect your relationship with him?
No. You know, I found it kind of astounding in a way that when it was clear Lyndon was running, and McCarthy is the guy that stood up and took the first shot and went through that tough New Hampshire primary, standing up to a sitting president, a campaign, you know, using kids, college kids and so on to try to make the difference, almost made it, forced the president's hand, Lyndon's hand, he stepped down, and then Bobby gets into the race. So there was that reality was always a little surprising to me, but it was very well received, and it wasn't long before Bobby had occupied the field.
Could Bobby Kennedy have won the presidency that year?
Possibly, but I believe that, oh, yeah, if he'd been nominated? Maybe. Although, Bobby was a strong, as I said before, empathetic advocate for poor people's problems, which I admire. That's where I tried to be in my life. But it left a lot of people in the middle in America feeling that they weren't getting much attention. And also, I think that the struggles within the Johnson administration, between Bobby and Johnson and the establishment, it had left some sour feelings. And so I'm not sure whether he would have won. The one thing he could have done is been able to pull together the enormous anti-war forces in America that were hobbling Humphrey's campaign. But my hunch is that Hubert was still our best candidate in that year, regardless of how tough it was.
Bobby Kennedy was jealous of McCarthy.
John,
Oh,
I'm getting interference on our mics.
How long ago did it start?
Just this last question.
Okay,
How's this one doing? We've got a backup mic here, but,
but it's not as good.
yeah.
So, is it still there?
It was just, I don't know if someone's using some kind of a,
The noise,
yeah, they're using some kind of an electrical, and actually, it's some kind of electrical equipment. I'm
but
trying to
there's something
see.
out in the hallway.
Direct this the other way, maybe that will help.
This is really great. I love.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
This is something people in Minnesota need to know.
It's tough stuff, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, does it sound
Seems
better?
to be okay right now.
Okay.
Okay, let's try it again.
Bobby Kennedy said, well, he was jealous of McCarthy because, as he himself said, McCarthy had all the A students. You must have felt the same way in a sense, because certainly you and Hubert Humphrey came to power powered by an attraction of pulling youth, getting young people involved. How did it feel to see some of the best and brightest students involved in the anti-war movement and going to work for McCarthy and Kennedy instead of Humphrey and you?
I understood it. I knew what was going on. I knew how people felt about it. I knew how bad that war was. I knew how many kids were getting chewed up in it. And I knew that we had to have an accounting. And it broke my heart that Hubert was in that predicament. I think if he'd stayed in the Senate, he would have been a continued opponent of the war. So it didn't surprise me. It saddened me. But on the other hand, You know, we are an open democracy, and when there are great problems, there's great reactions.
No one contributed more to the civil rights movement than Hubert Humphrey. Yet in 1968, well, you know, a very large portion of the African Americans were supporting Bobby Kennedy in the primaries, California, other places. It must have been difficult for you and for Hubert to see that happen too.
Well, same answer. I'm sure it's difficult. And I think Hubert is beloved in the black community, of his generation, because they know he's the guy that opened up these issues and walked the plank and made the big differences. But now this is years later, this war is breaking out. Martin Luther King decides to make the war a civil rights issue in effect. And although that was a controversial decision within his movement, he did it. And I think, and these are black kids being drafted too, and black families being affected like that. And it drove a lot of that support to Bobby Kennedy, who for them was right on the war and was right on the other issues.
So there were a lot of setbacks in 1968 that undercut the credibility of Johnson Humphrey. The dam sort of broke. When did you personally begin to have doubts about the war in Vietnam?
I mentioned that trip to Vietnam when I was a young senator. I believe I was 65. And I went around that country for a week, went to some of the bases around the country, talked to some of the soldiers and some of the generals on the side, spent a lot of time with the reporters who were over there, like Johnny Apple, and I'm sorry I remember there was a reporter there from the Tribune, and they took me around and talked to me. And I came back with a much more sobered idea about Vietnam. And that took a while to get me moving, but from then on out I had my doubts.
At the Democratic National Convention, I think you also brokered some kind of deal with the Mississippi Democrats.
That was in '64.
Oh, okay. I'm a little off on that one.
But let me say something about
Yeah.
'68. '64, we finally came clean with race in our own party. I mean, we've been in Washington passing bills, but as far as our party was concerned, if Mississippi wanted to put together an all-white delegation of people who incidentally had no intention of voting for you, they were our guests. So in that convention, we passed the rule, and I was involved in that prohibited any delegation that's been selected based on discrimination from being seated. And so now here is '68, 4 years later, and all these states now that had Lily White for the first time had delegations, often with half the delegates. Half of the Mississippi Freedom Democrats who came to the '64 convention came back as delegates. And it was a big change in American life. It happened in '68. There's so much more going on that people didn't notice, but that was an entirely different convention than had ever assembled before in the Democratic Party's history.
You talked a little bit about how LBJ got in the way of a plank at the National Convention that would have helped Humphrey.
Yeah.
Also, Humphrey later on tried to break from
He did.
LBJ. And then just any more comments on how badly LBJ's inflexibility hurt?
I'm not sure that Lyndon was supporting Hubert. He was, he'd meet with Nixon, say nice things about him. He didn't show up or say anything for Hubert. And then the last week when Humphrey's polls are going upward and it looked like Humphrey might win, Johnson came to a big rally in Boston, or I forget where it is, Fort Worth or something, huge Humphrey rally, and he came with Hubert, and they walked around the inside of the arena, and there was a tremendous response to that, and so he got there finally, but it was a slow show.
Yeah, just not, I'm on my last page here. So, I guess it's Humphrey's delay in softening his position on the war hurt him, we've kind of covered that. McCarthy, you want to say something about that, or?
Well, you know, I think Humphrey was in a real trap. Johnson was the president. Humphrey wanted to break and show his independence. Johnson was very he had a tremendous amount of pressure he was putting on Hubert by saying, you know, if you do this, you're going to encourage the North Vietnamese. They're going to come down there. I've got 2 son-in-laws over there that are fighting in this war. They could be killed, and I deserve more out of you than this. And it was terrible stuff. And I think Humphrey was looking at it, and of course there were negotiations going on, and he didn't want to undermine it. He was vice president, push him in a tougher position, and he did make the break. The public saw it in the Salt Lake City speech, and the public started moving to him. The rallies are always full of critics breaking up, suddenly disappeared, and they started cheering Hubert again. Humphrey had the momentum. If we'd had 2 more days, 1 more day, he would have been president.
I remember that. I was staying up late that night.
Yep.
I have a strong impression that you have been far more generous in your treatment of McCarthy than he was with you. Do you think McCarthy had a mean streak?
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
He was, I think he was all right with me. And he just was living his life. He was never part of an organization. He didn't think in those terms. He was brilliant, you know, and he was a poet. He had a strong private side to his life, and but I don't think he was ever offensive to me.
In 1968, and Emily and I were just kind of disagreeing over this, but in 1968, the Democratic Party was the party of war. It was also the party of peace, and it was a place where the debate about the war took place. It had a chaotic effect on the election of '68, but were there benefits down the road as a result of a whole new generation of activists that got involved in the party because it had been the party of that debate?
I would say yes. Whenever a political party opens up, takes its responsibilities seriously, accepts controversy, works those issues out in a fundamental way, it leaves scars, but at the same time, you soon get the idea that that's where you go when you have big issues. If you've got civil rights problems and one party works on it and the other party closes you out, guess where people interested in civil rights are going to go? When people wanted a forum to end that war and one party offered it and the other party didn't, one party was willing to criticize its own president. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, under a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, held these profound hearings, in effect attacking the war of their own president. I think, you know, it disables you a little bit, and yet that's real life, and we were around the real issues, and yes, I think it helps a lot in the long run.
How did the chaos of '68 impact your own bid for the presidency?
Well, I'm not sure. You know, I ran in '84. That's a long time between '68 and a lifetime in terms of politics. I think the issues that we had were more shaped by domestic questions. You know, the people's judgments of the Carter-Mondale administration, the war had long been over. So I don't think, there was maybe something, but I don't know what it'd be.
Then I guess there's one last question, which is kind of this, on this summation, and then I want to talk about one of the crowning legislative achievements that year, which I think you might remember what that was, but it's now 2009. What were the, 1968, 2009, what did that year put in play that we still are living with or experiencing today?
I think it created some doubts, some skepticism about about human nature in government, about we became more realistic and less idealistic about our government. Not entirely, but at least for a while. I think the public's trust in the process was sharply diminished.
And then the juxtaposition here, and Tommy, this is the person who passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers.
Yeah.
If he hadn't done that, it would look like an outlet mall.
It would like.
And so,
Like
this
the
is,
Zake
Let me,
River.
let me phrase this one, because I went kayaking last year
okay.
up on, it was the Brule River,
Yeah.
or no, it was on the St. Croix River.
Yeah.
And I bought this T-shirt and it says Wild and Scenic River Act,
Yeah.
40 years.
Yeah.
And then we were, kind of doing this research for this
Yeah.
interview,
Yeah.
and I said, oh, that's, Senator Mondale.
Yeah.
He was the one that got that passed, and I said, that's something good that happened in
Oh, yeah.
1968, because I was 17 and I just thought my
Was
world.
that 68 when we passed that?
Yeah.
Well, one of my dearest friends in public life was Gaylord Nelson from Wisconsin, now gone, but he was the saint of the environmental movement. And I was, all through my career in the Senate, as vice president, I always looked to him for advice. And one of the things he did, he came up to me when I was brand new senator, he said, I'm trying to introduce this bill to save the St. Croix River and put it in the national river system and pass this national wild rivers, scenic rivers legislation. He said, would you co-sponsor? I said, absolutely, let's go. Because I knew about that river. I loved that river, I love it now. It's been a big breakthrough. I agree with the question. If we hadn't passed that law, and we did, that river could have well become like so many of the rivers in the east that just become dumping grounds for pollution and junk and commercial developments that are discordant with what should be the mood of the river. Still got a lot of problems at that river because there's so much pressure on it. But without that legislation, it would have been bad.
without a doubt.
Yep.
I sent you an email because I spent a lot of time kayaking on it.
Yeah.
And thanking you for it. And
Oh, I love, we got a house now out there. And I love hearing the clank of canoes, kids, the oars, the paddles touch the side of the canoe and you could hear it up the river. And they're so happy going down that river. And it's so quiet and so lovely. Man, it's good stuff.
that's kind of one of the things we want to build into this. We want to
Yeah.
make 1968 not just
Right.
we want to say that at least something good came out of this, and it's about you.
Well, it's, a lot of us. This was part of the high tide years that I talked about earlier, when we, of course, grappled with the war, which is terrible, but where we had the votes to pass civil rights legislation, environmental legislation, student assistance, elementary and secondary education, occupational safety. We had the votes to do just about anything we wanted to do, And I'm proud of the fact that we used that period to get things done that had to be done and had to be done quickly, like the river system that you talk about. If we tried that 10 years later, what we were able to save in the river system were it was to save the rivers from things that had not yet happened. We were not able to roll back a river and create, pristine river out of a river that had become sewer. And so the timeliness of what we did was very important there.
You know, it's just, people just don't
Oh,
have any
yeah.
idea what that is, what that means
Oh, yeah.
today.
Yep.
I go out there, I live in Stillwater, so I walk along the river every
Is that
day. Plus
wonderful?
I go kayaking all the time.
Oh, yeah.
It's just beautiful.
Oh, yeah.
It's a gorgeous
Yeah.
river.
I gotta get going here.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
The only other thing we were wondering is, and we've already gotten enough of your time that we should be ashamed to even ask this question. Having said that,
Here we go. Yeah.
we would love to get a shot of you on the river at some point over the summer that we
Okay.
could,
What we'd like to do is start with you on the river
Yeah.
and, thinking back to
Yeah.
68 and
Yeah.
then go through that horrible year and then end on the river because
Can
that's
you,
the beauty.
okay, here, I'd be glad to do that, but could you call Linda?
Yeah.
And just let her organize it? Because
Yes.
we'll be out there.
yeah.
We'll be out there. I know over the 4th, we usually go out for a week.
That'd be great.
We go to the Marine Day, 4th of July
Oh,
parade.
yeah.
Big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do Afton, we live in Afton.
Yeah, yeah.
Tommy and I live in Afton.
Oh, yeah. They have a good